right, in this video, I'm gonna show you how to go from this to this, maybe even this. We'll see where we get. Now, I'm gonna do this using the 6-step principle that we teach at Artwod, so pay attention. What we're gonna do is we're gonna start with number 1, which is structure. Structure, structure, structure. I keep repeating it, and I need to keep repeating it, okay? So structure is essential. What does that mean? We need to just understand spatially how the head will sit in space. So that means, like, do we understand the structure of a head in its simplest form? Just like, does it make sense in space? Can we simplify it into a box, into a sphere? Yes, okay, great. Do we understand that? Fantastic. Can we then break it up into maybe a couple of simple forms and combine those together? All right, fantastic. Can we understand some basic proportions of the head? In this case, very simple, just the Loomis principle of dividing the sphere and then using the rule of thirds for the hairline, the eyebrows, the bottom of the nose, and the chin. That's all we need to understand, basically. We need to understand these proportions and their basic shape in space, and we need to break it up. We need to be able to break it up as best as we can, and in as many ways as we can, because there's only like one way that will stick for you. And that's important. A lot of the times you will be forced sort of to learn a principle that might just not work for you. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen this or have witnessed or experienced this. And it's the same for me. There were things that just didn't work for me. There were methods that just didn't work for me. So I always try and advocate to find my own method. But first, you need to be taught different methods and then see if you can sort of cherry pick one that really works for just your way of thinking. So, okay, and then when we do it on a head level, then next up, we need to do it on a feature level. So we need to understand the basic structure of the eyes, the mouth, the nose, and how that applies on top of the head. Very basic, simple stuff. We just need to understand how that thing fits on top of that other thing in space. Super easy. Once we understand that, we need to practice it, right? That's why we have workouts in our roadmap. You need to practice it, preferably a lot, so you need to repeat it, but you need to practice it sort of from an imagination point of view so that you can really see for yourself if you have retained the information. Then, going into step 2 is in this case, education. Now, we sometimes switch it around. Education, why? Is because we want to understand anatomy in its basic, most rudimentary form. So again, what are we doing? We've just learned all of the structure, right? We've just learned all of the structure. Now what we're doing, we're going to manipulate that structure. Again, if you can't manipulate forms, you need to do our beginner road first. But if you can, then you can sort of start making a very simplified version of things that are actually anatomically pretty complex, like the skull, like a nose, right? We can just take the simple form that we have first, then look at anatomy or the simplified version of anatomy and see how we can, again, just make simple, rudimentary, manipulated forms, put those together to create the illusion of a complex anatomical form. Because again, of course, we want to move and progress towards something that is seemingly more complex and believable, right? As soon as we're going to do portraits, they need to start looking believable. So we need to apply some of the rules of anatomy. Now, in Artwod, we call this anatomy-informed shape manipulation. Why the big word for something very easy to understand? Is basically we're looking at anatomy, but we're simplifying it in such a way that we can extract simple forms from it and don't have to worry about anatomy that much. Because yes, you need to know anatomy, but I don't remember all of the anatomy all the time. And I've studied anatomy a ton, okay? But it just doesn't serve me well all the time. What serves me really well is just understanding the mannequinization of that anatomy. So once we understand that, we can then make a portrait without anything special or characterization or personality, just like almost like a robotic portrait, using those anatomy-informed shapes we learned, put on top of the structure we learned in phase 1. Cool. When we know that, we then move into phase 3, which is manipulation. When we learn, we also need to have fun, because the fun actually is easier to retain information. That's why a lot of you guys are so good at gaming, because you're having fun, right? And you're just remembering information that the game gives you in terms of feedback. And because you're having fun, it's easier to remember. right? That's why we try to gamify learning a lot. So basically what we do now is we take a step back first and we just start having a lot of fun with silly shapes. So we're taking silly shapes and we're seeing how we can now sort of reverse engineer that structure into it. Can we give it eyes? Can we give it a nose in a simplified version? But can we have fun with it? Can we warp the shapes, inflate them, stretch them, whatever we want to do with them, and still create the resemblance of a face? When we can do that, we can also do it on an individual feature level where we just take any silly shape basically and try to turn it into an ear or nose or lips, because that will also teach us to be more creative with the individual features. And I think that is crucially important because that will teach you to sort of create your own style and overall just be more free with your application. So what I mean by that is that you're not that concerned anymore about being super technically accurate. You're just more concerned with making it look believable because you have like a crazy silly shape. Now you just have to make it look like an ear or a nose. So it's no longer about, is it technically in the correct proportions? Because I'll tell you what, if you want to be really good at drawing characters, you have to be able to work with silly shapes because most faces have silly shapes. Even in reality, right? If we would all have perfectly structured features, we would all look like robots and we'd be indistinguishable. So very boring. So that's why we learn manipulation. Then, once we can do manipulation, then we're going to look at observating. So that means that we're going to start observing people. We're going to start observing things from real life and using all of the knowledge that we've learned up until this point, right? So nothing about shading yet, nothing about anything complex, just about those manipulated features that we learned, a bit of that anatomical knowledge, and a lot of that shape manipulation. And then we're going to see how we can apply that onto things we see in real life. So real photos from people. But here's the catch. What I think is very important to just really boost those skills tenfold is we're not only going to copy what we see, we're then also going to try and draw that from a different angle. Why will this now be, one, very, very beneficial for your learning, but two, also easier because you've done all of that work beforehand. You've done all of that structure work in space. You've done all of that anatomical and structural breakdown of the individual features. So now it just becomes a matter of putting two and two together. And this becomes a lot easier because once you start analyzing people from observation, from real life, my goal with that roadmap that we made is to have you understand and analyze and deconstruct the things you see in real life. And once you can deconstruct them and almost no longer see them really as, it's a bad analogy, but no longer see them as people, but see them as structure and shapes, it will be much easier to then translate that into something different in a different angle from imagination and still keep resemblance. Because a lot of you, even those that want to get into fine art and want to paint portraits, the ability to be able to draw from imagination will serve you a lifetime because then you're no longer manipulated by what you see in the reference and the reference alone. You can adjust things to your liking because you perfectly understand the structure and the manipulation underneath. And I think that is crucially important. Right, and then eventually we move into the realm of imagination. So what does that mean? Well, we start playing with shapes. We just create silly shapes basically, and we put facial features on top of them, again, based on everything we learned so far. And this is where you start creating your own characters. This is where you start to have a better understanding of how to take something graphically interesting and make it believable. Because that's essentially what you do if you want to design from imagination, is you take something that is graphically interesting and turn it into a character. This happens a lot, by the way, in animation. Right? In animation, there's like very graphical sort of characters, but they're then given believability. And that also has to do with shape language. I'm not going to cover that too much just yet. But it's like, how is a graphic shape now translated into a believable character? Because that adds personality to the character. And that's what we can train with these assignments. And then eventually we put two and two together and we make a very graphically interesting shape. We turn that into a character, and then we can turn that character into different angles and also give it different expressions. We can learn expressions by first, again, simplifying it. So the way that we do it at Artwod is learning from emojis, because the emojis are very graphical, right? They are graphical expressions. But then what we do is we take everything we learned from the structure, from the anatomical features, from the manipulation, and we add that on top of that graphical expression. And then it becomes a very believable expression. Almost, this is like, for me, this is a short hack into getting better character expressions. This is my hack. And then we take everything we learned so far, and what we're going to do now is, because we understand that structure underneath, because we understand some of those anatomy informed shapes, we can now just indicate form on top of them. So at Artwod, when we give you an introduction to shading, we don't actually call it shading, we call it indicating form. Because for me, it's a much faster way into learning how to shade, because you just start adding believability to a 2D structure. And this is the exact same thing here. We're going to start learning how to just take these structures and start adding form to them. So not necessarily shading, adding form to them. And if they become a little bit more anatomically accurate, we still keep the form, and we're starting to create a lot of believability just by understanding the plane changes and where we want to indicate form. Once we start understanding this, then we can have a little bit more liberty with it, and you can get creative with it. Now, this takes a bit more practice. Of course, you're not going to do this in a span of weeks, but once you understand this, you can be a bit more creative with it. You can add some design to it. You can add some nice fancy touches of brush strokes to it, and you can create something very, very interesting and cool. And I guess that's all I have to say about it. So if you want to practice this, you want to have some consistency in it, if you want to have a structured roadmap, we literally have the Artwod roadmap. So you can go check that out. You can start using it for free at artwod.com. If not, then just you can use these principles for free as I've given them to you, and you can start sort of kicking your learning journey into high gear. All right, have fun.